Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. Last time we ended with that most hated of all taxes imposed in the colonies, the Stamp Act. And the colonists erupted with that most famous of all American cries, no taxation without representation. Now, despite George Grenfell's doctrine of virtual representation, which to the colonists seemed about as logical as hiring a ham sandwich to do your taxes, King George actually backed off and repealed the Stamp Act. And speaking of George, I want to begin this lecture by showing you a picture of a statue of King George. At the news of the Stamp Act repeal, New York patriots commissioned and erected this statue of King George to show their appreciation to his magnanimity and indulgence. And I want you to remember the statue because it'll come back into the story a little later. All right, let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
Now, we've already talked a lot about the grievances of the colonists against the crown, and you should know that to the colonists, independence was not a foregone conclusion. In fact, they made several attempts to address their grievances to the king and to Parliament. Delegates from each of the colonies got together in what was known as the Continental Congress, and they tried to draft petitions to persuade the English authorities to extend them their natural rights as British citizens. And this is a really important point because for most of the time before the fighting actually broke out, the Americans wanted to remain British citizens. They only wanted the British crown to extend them their rights as such. But Parliament was not in the mood to grant the demands of the saucy and rebellious Americans, and so they further clamped down on the rebels. And now we come to the fateful date of April 1775. It was in April 1775 that a British commander in Boston was charged with subduing rebellious activity in the colony, and so had his troops march on Lexington and Concord in order to seize their supply of gunpowder and bag their leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The British figured that the sight of their gleaming bayonets would intimidate the colonial rabble stationed at Lexington, but Adams and Hancock and their men refused to scatter. The British fired on them, killing 8 of what were known as the Minutemen. The troops then pushed on to Concord and were routed by the Americans to the tune of about 300 casualties. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you get a war started. But even still, with an armed conflict in the works, the notion of claiming independence was still not widely desired. Enter Thomas Paine. In 1776, Thomas Paine published a little pamphlet called Common Sense, and it was this pamphlet that largely swayed the American people to call for independence. So it's important for us to understand what was in that pamphlet. Paine began his treatise with an explanation of the nature of government, which, as it turned out, was positively dripping with Enlightenment ideals. He said, following the European philosopher John Locke, that governments existed only by the consent of the governed. In other words, a government can only legitimately rule a people if those people have given the government their permission to rule them. Additionally, he appealed to natural laws, saying that nowhere on God's green earth is it natural or right that the smaller body should rule the larger body. So why should a tiny island across the sea rule so large a continent as America? And furthermore, Paine argued that America ought to cut the cord with Britain and establish its own independent Republican-style government where the power flowed from the people. And with all these arguments stacked up together, Paine argues that it is only common sense that Americans should declare their independence from Britain. Now, what made this pamphlet so powerful is that Paine wrote in simple language that all the common people could understand. And when it hit the streets, it spread like crazy. The first printing was 120,000, and then that sold out. And then there was another printing, and another printing, and another printing. And now, all of a sudden, people are talking about independence as the most sensible option. And all this chatter reached the ears of the Continental Congress, who, under the eloquence and leadership of John Adams, began seriously debating this issue. And once they determined that independence was the only real option, they tasked Thomas Jefferson with drafting a formal Declaration of Independence. And with the editorial help of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, Jefferson wrote what is perhaps one of the greatest documents in American history, which begins with those magisterial words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, if you're thinking that those words smell like Thomas Jefferson stepped in a big pile of Enlightenment thought, you're right. You see, the Enlightenment taught the people of that age that they were blessed with liberty as a God-given right, and that individual talent ought to be the basis of success in this world rather than hereditary privilege. And these ideas were so powerful that the people in France and then later in Haiti embraced them and inspired their own independence movements. And these ideals even inspired, if you can believe it, men to exult in the role of American women. Now, we're not talking about voting rights or anything. Let's not get crazy. But it was generally understood that in order to have a functioning republic, you needed to have a virtuous population. And where were you going to get a virtuous population? Yo mama! This concept became known as the Republican motherhood, and what it meant at bottom was that it was women who were responsible for raising children into adults who were able to govern themselves. And despite what that may sound like to 21st century ears, in that day, women gloried in their newfound place in American society. Anyway, back to the Declaration of Independence. Congress adopted the Declaration on July 4th, 1776, and now British America became America, and now they had a war of independence on their hands. Now just stop for a minute and pretend like you don't know the outcome. Imagine how foolish it must have seemed for America to start a war with Great Britain. At this point in history, Britain had the most powerful military in the world and had bukus of money to pay for it, more money than the colonists could ever dream of. America, on the other hand, had 13 largely unaffiliated, self-interested states with no standing army and certainly no professional soldiers. In the eyes of any rational person, the fight would have looked something like this. The odds are not stacked in favor of the skinny white kid. Even so, the Congress believed that the Americans were up for the fight, so they elected unanimously the venerated Virginian veteran George Washington to lead the Continental Army into battle. And Washington soon learned that these men were not fit for battle. Many of them were not clothed properly, had malfunctioning weapons, complained without ceasing, and were, in Washington's estimation, more than a little cowardly. On many occasions, Washington ordered his men to charge, and instead they fled against direct orders, and in some cases he got so disgusted that he stood up in the middle of them, and I'm told that we have actual footage of Washington's reaction. And yet, somehow, with this ragtag group of men, Washington was able to win some decisive victories. The most important of these victories was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Now, at this point, America was in desperate need of foreign help to win this war. And although the details of the Battle of Saratoga do not concern us here, it is the outcome of that battle that is incredibly important. Because when Washington's men routed the British at Saratoga, it induced the French to come in and assist the American cause. Well, that's not altogether true, because the French didn't really care as much about the American cause as they did whipping the British like an ornery schoolchild. And so the turning point in the war came when France sent aid in the forms of guns and ships and soldiers. But even with French aid, the Americans were in desperate need of war materiel, and so we come back to the statue of King George. In an act of delicious irony, the Americans yanked the statue to the ground, melted the lead into bullets, and started firing on the British. The New York postmaster Ebenezer Hazard wrote in a letter, "His statue here has been pulled down to make musket ball of, so that his troops will probably have melted majesty fired at them." Are you kidding me? Is that not the most perfect symbol of the American Revolution? They melted George and they started firing George at the British soldiers. Okay, let's get to the point. After years of battle, the British were tired of chasing Americans through the countryside, and they were even tireder of paying for it. So when the French routed the British Navy off the Chesapeake Bay and Washington defeated the Royal Army at Yorktown, the British surrendered. And as Washington led his conquered foes out of the city, they sang in their bewilderment the old tavern song, "The world turned upside down." And indeed it had. And ladies and gentlemen, that's how you get the United States of America. I'll see you next time.